What would you do if one day, without warning, your HOA demanded that you stop protecting your own home? For 2 years, my neighborhood had been exactly what I wanted: quiet, safe, and private. The kind of place where people waved politely but mostly kept to themselves. I wasn't close with my neighbors, but that was fine. I liked my privacy. My backyard was my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind after long days at work without worrying about who was watching. At least, that's how it used to be. Then things started getting weird. At first, it was small things: someone cutting across my lawn, a few neighbors lingering near my driveway longer than usual, hushed voices carrying over the fence when they thought I wasn't home. I brushed it off as nothing. But when I caught a man, someone I didn't recognize, leaning over my fence, peering into my yard as if he was scoping something out, I knew it wasn't just in my head. I'd been through this before. Years ago, my car was broken into while parked in what I thought was a safe neighborhood. The police never caught the guy, and I was left feeling exposed. That feeling never really went away, so when I moved here, I made a promise to myself: I wouldn't let that happen again. That's why I installed the cameras. Nothing crazy, just a few small, professional-grade security cameras positioned to cover the main areas around my home. One above the driveway, another facing the backyard, a couple mounted on the corners of my house. I even put up clearly visible warning signs: property under surveillance. It wasn't about spying on anyone. I didn't care what my neighbors did. It was about safety. My safety. For a while, everything was fine. The cameras did their job. I slept better knowing I had an extra layer of security. No one said a word about them. Until one day, I came home from work, checked my mail, and saw a letter from the HOA. At first, I thought it was the usual nonsense: some update about landscaping rules or a reminder about trash pickup. But the moment I tore it open, my stomach dropped. It was a formal complaint. The HOA was demanding that I remove my security cameras immediately. I stared at the letter, reading it over again, trying to make sense of it. The HOA was claiming my cameras were a violation of neighborhood aesthetics. Aesthetics? These weren't neon signs or flashing billboards. They were discreet, professional-grade security cameras, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. And yet, the letter made it clear: remove them or face consequences. At first, I shrugged it off. There was no way they could enforce something like this. This wasn't a gated community with strict surveillance policies. This was my home. My property. I knew my rights, and I had no intention of taking the cameras down just because some HOA busybody decided they didn't like them. But a few days later, another letter arrived. This time, it was a formal warning. And it wasn't just a vague demand, it came with a threat of fines. $500 per camera per week. I clenched my jaw. That was an outrageous amount of money. I had never even been officially notified of any fines before this, and suddenly, I was receiving a final notice for an absurd penalty. It reeked of deliberate targeting. I called the HOA office, determined to get some answers. The woman on the other end sounded polite at first, but as soon as I brought up the cameras, her tone shifted. "You were notified of the violations weeks ago," she said flatly. I frowned. "No, I wasn't. This is the first fine notice I've received. Can you show me proof that I was ever warned before this?" There was a pause. A slight hesitation. Then she said, "Well, I can't pull up that information right now, but I'm sure the board sent the notices. It's your responsibility to check your mail." I felt my blood pressure rising. "That's convenient," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "Well, I'm telling you now, I never received any notice, and I'm not paying a fine for something I didn't agree to. You have no authority to dictate what I do on my private property." That's when I heard it, a quiet scoff in the background. A muffled voice, like someone had covered the receiver but didn't do it well enough. And then a familiar, unmistakable voice came through, dripping with condescension. "You'll regret this. Karen." Of course, it was her. She was the one pulling the strings. She was the one who decided my cameras were a problem. I had heard stories about her, how she'd bullied other homeowners over petty violations, how she'd gotten people fined for things as small as leaving their trash cans out a few minutes too long. But this was different. This wasn't about grass height or mailbox colors. This was about my right to protect my home. I hung up the phone, my hands clenched into fists. If they thought they could scare me into backing down, they were dead wrong. That night, as I was locking up my house, something nagged at the back of my mind. Karen's voice, that smug arrogance, that implied threat. I checked my cameras before heading to bed. Everything looked normal. Until it didn't. At 2:37 a.m., an alert went off on my phone. Motion detected. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the footage. My backyard floodlight had turned on, and a figure, dressed in dark clothing, was standing by my fence. My breath caught in my throat as I zoomed in. Whoever it was had something in their hand, reaching toward my camera. I watched as the figure hesitated, glancing around before quickly retreating into the night. I immediately rewound the footage, adjusting the brightness, trying to get a clearer look at their face. And then my stomach dropped. It was Mark Reynolds. One of the HOA board members. He had tried to disable my security camera. The next morning, I wasted no time. I printed out screenshots from the footage and drove straight to the HOA office. If they wanted to play dirty, they were about to see just how far I was willing to go to defend myself. The office was empty except for the receptionist, who barely looked up from her desk as I walked in. "I need to speak to someone on the board. Now." My voice was calm, but my patience was hanging by a thread. She gave me a bored look. "Do you have an appointment?" I slammed the printed screenshots down on the counter. "No, but I have proof that one of your board members trespassed on my property last night." That got her attention. She hesitated, glanced down at the photos, then stiffened. I'll see if someone is available." Less than 5 minutes later, Mark Reynolds himself walked into the lobby, looking as smug as ever. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly in place, and if I hadn't seen him sneaking around my yard at 2 in the morning, I would have thought he was just another well-dressed HOA lackey. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, as if we were old friends. "What seems to be the issue?" I took a step forward, keeping my voice even. "The issue, Mark, is that I caught you on my property last night trying to disable my security camera." He blinked, then let out a short, amused laugh. "That's quite the accusation." I didn't waver. I pulled out my phone, swiped through the footage, and turned the screen toward him. "Explain this." Mark barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "That's not me." I narrowed my eyes. "You're really going to sit here and lie to my face?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair as if this conversation was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Look, maybe someone was on your property. But if they were, it wasn't me. And even if it was, I'd have every reason to be there. The HOA has the right to inspect properties for violations." My grip on my phone tightened. "Violations? You mean my security cameras? The ones I legally installed?" Mark gave me a slow, condescending smile. "The HOA has to ensure that all properties align with community standards. If we need to check something, we check it. It's nothing personal." I wanted to punch the arrogance off his face. Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay level-headed. "Trespassing is illegal, Mark. If you or anyone else steps foot on my property again, I'll be calling the police." He chuckled. "Call them. What do you think they'll do? The HOA runs this neighborhood, Carter. You don't. You'll learn that sooner or later. I turned on my heel and walked out before I did something I'd regret. By the time I got home, I was still fuming, but I barely had time to process it before I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood on my porch. "Sir, we received a report about unauthorized surveillance on private property." I stared at them. "You've got to be kidding me." One of the officers gave me an apologetic look. "We need to check your security setup. We got a complaint from the HOA that your cameras might be illegally recording neighboring homes." I clenched my jaw, already knowing exactly who had called them. "Karen." "Everything is legal," I said, stepping aside. "Feel free to check for yourselves." They took a quick look, asked me a few questions, and within 10 minutes, they confirmed exactly what I already knew. My cameras were positioned properly, recording only my property. Before they left, one of the officers shook his head. "Honestly, this is a waste of our time. This isn't the first time we've had to deal with HOA nonsense like this." I smirked. "Karen's behind it, isn't she?" He sighed. "We can't say who made the call, but let's just say we're familiar with her." As they left, I watched them go with a new realization settling over me. The HOA wasn't just trying to fine me into submission anymore. They were actively trying to weaponize the system against me. I wasn't just fighting a petty homeowners association. I was fighting people who would lie, trespass, and manipulate the law just to get their way. But they had made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. I knew the HOA wasn't done with me, but I hadn't expected them to go for the kill this quickly. A few days after the police visit, another letter showed up in my mailbox, this one stamped with urgent, HOA meeting notice. The tone of the letter was different from the last ones, less of a demand and more of a power move. The board had called a special meeting to address a community-wide security concern and required my attendance. They weren't just threatening me behind closed doors anymore. They were about to try and make an example out of me. When I arrived at the HOA office that evening, the room was already full. Dozens of homeowners sat in the stiff plastic chairs arranged in rows, murmuring amongst themselves. At the front, the HOA board sat behind a long table, with Karen and Mark right in the middle. Karen's face was practically glowing with satisfaction, and Mark sat beside her, looking as if he had already won. Rick Holloway, the HOA president, cleared his throat and stood. "We're here today to discuss a serious matter that affects the harmony and privacy of our neighborhood." His voice carried that forced authority of a man who liked being in control. I crossed my arms, already seeing where this was going. Rick continued, "Multiple residents have raised concerns about invasive surveillance in our community. It has come to our attention that some homeowners are engaging in excessive monitoring of public and private spaces, creating discomfort among their neighbors." I let out a short laugh. "Let me guess, this is about me?" Karen leaned forward, lacing her fingers together like a villain in a bad movie. "We're simply enforcing community standards, Ethan." I shook my head. "You're not enforcing anything. You're making up new rules to get rid of something you personally don't like." She scoffed. "This isn't personal. It's about protecting our neighborhood's character." Rick cut in, "Which is why we are introducing a new community guideline tonight, a formal amendment to the HOA charter that would prohibit outdoor surveillance equipment that intrudes on the privacy of other residents." My stomach clenched. They were trying to outlaw security cameras entirely. Karen smirked. "This rule, if passed, will require all homeowners to remove surveillance equipment visible from public or shared spaces. Home security should not come at the expense of a community's comfort." I could feel the trap closing. They had stacked the room with their supporters, knowing that a rule change required a majority vote. They were trying to rush this through before anyone could fight back. I glanced around the room. A few of my neighbors looked uncomfortable, but others nodded along, clearly swayed by Karen's performance. I had to shut this down before it gained traction. I took a slow breath, then pulled out the folder I had prepared. Before anyone votes on this, I want everyone to see something. Karen's expression flickered just slightly. I walked up to the front and placed the printed screenshots of Mark on the table. This is footage from my security cameras. 2 nights ago, one of your board members, Mark Reynolds, was caught sneaking onto my property, trying to disable my cameras. And now, conveniently, you want to ban them? Gasps rippled through the room. Mark's smug expression faltered for the first time. Karen's lips thinned. Rick frowned. This is a serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's proof. I turned to the crowd. Think about this for a second. If the HOA is willing to break into my yard to silence me, what makes you think they won't do the same to you when they decide you're next? Murmurs spread. Doubt crept into a few of the faces in the crowd. I took it a step further. And let's talk about those fines they tried to slap on me. I never received a first notice, just a final warning out of nowhere. And when I called the HOA, they couldn't provide any record that they had ever warned me before that. A woman in the back, Lisa, one of my quieter neighbors, spoke up hesitantly. Wait, they did that to me too. Karen's head snapped toward her, her expression darkening. This is irrelevant to tonight's vote. I took a step forward. No, Karen, this is exactly what tonight's vote is about. It's about control. You don't care about security cameras. You care about making sure nobody pushes back against your authority. Karen opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Rick lifted his hand. For the first time, he looked uncertain. He glanced at Mark, then at Karen, then at the increasingly restless crowd. He sighed. We need to table this discussion for now. Karen whirled toward him. Rick. Enough, he said, and just like that, the meeting was over. I turned, walking out of the office, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on my back. I knew this wasn't over, but for the first time since this all started, I felt like I had turned the tide. Karen wanted a power play. She just lost her grip. I knew the HOA wasn't done with me, but I also knew they were starting to lose control. Karen had spent years bullying homeowners into submission, but this time, she had picked the wrong fight. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to expose them. The next morning, I reached out to a local news station that had covered HOA abuse cases before. I told them everything, the illegal fines, the attempted break-in, the staged meeting to manipulate a rule change. I even sent them the footage of Mark trespassing on my property. Within hours, they called me back. They were interested. A news crew arrived at my house the next day. The reporter asked all the right questions. Why do you think the HOA is targeting you? Have they done this to other homeowners? What does this mean for personal property rights? I answered every one of them, making sure to emphasize the pattern of intimidation and power abuse. The HOA wasn't about protecting the community, it was about controlling it. The segment aired that evening, and it spread faster than I expected. Neighbors I had never spoken to started reaching out, sharing their own horror stories about Karen and the HOA. Some had been fined for minor infractions, mailboxes an inch too high, grass a shade too long, a holiday decoration left up one day past the deadline. Others had been pressured into silence, afraid of what would happen if they pushed back. Then the online comments started rolling in. People from all over the country began sharing their own HOA nightmares, some even worse than mine. The pressure was building, and the HOA could feel it. 2 days later, I got a call from Rick Holloway. His tone was completely different. Ethan, the board has reviewed the situation, and we've decided to drop the matter entirely. The fines, the complaints, everything. He hesitated before adding, Karen has been asked to step down from her position. I smirked. They weren't reviewing anything, they were saving face. They knew they had lost, and Karen? She had finally pushed too far. That evening, as I sat on my back porch, I saw her walking past my house, her usual smug expression gone. She didn't even look in my direction. She had finally been beaten at her own game. In the end, I didn't just win. I set a precedent. The cameras stayed up. The HOA learned to back off. And Karen? She had to live with the fact that she wasn't in charge anymore. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.